Welcome to the Hearts and Men podcast, a podcast to inspire men on their healing journey and give practical tools to use in everyday life for mental and emotional support. I'm your host, Aaron Cartwright. All right, welcome back to the Hearts and Men podcast. My next guest is Mark Aiston. He's a former TV sports presenter in Adelaide, currently running a radio station in Adelaide as well. I want to get him on because he's got a really good story. It's not because he's a TV presenter or former TV presenter. It's actually what he's been through, what he's gone through, and how he's healed a lot of stuff. It's very, very inspiring. So I'd love to get into it. Welcome, Mark.
Hey, Aaron. How are you doing?
Doing very well, thank you. Thank you for coming.
It's okay.
I would love to start. Let's just start maybe with the TV, because I remember watching you when I was younger on TV in Adelaide. So you were quite very well known in Adelaide for the TV stuff. So I know we're not here to talk about the TV, but I would love to get a bit of context about your past and what you did.
Yeah, of course. Well, I don't know whether you watched me when I was at Channel 10 or maybe even further back than that when I was at the ABC, but I started in TV in about 1982, something like that. I was calling races actually before that from about 78 with 5DN, and then I went to Darwin for a couple of years and sort of, floated around up there and then got a job at the ABC in Adelaide. So I started there in about 83, I think, Aaron, and was a TV presenter and a radio presenter and a sports commentator. Then I went to Channel 10 in 1996 as a reporter, and then a year later I was the sports presenter there up until 5 years ago. Also as part of all of that, I worked for other radio stations. I've done breakfast radio, a lot of podcasts, and I also did comedy for Channel 10 when I did national gigs like the Melbourne Cup or the Sydney Olympics, and yeah, as I say, I did that until about 5 years ago, and the last 2 years I've been running a radio station, a small community radio station in Adelaide, which I thoroughly love.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. So can we get into your story about why I'm actually getting you on here and the struggles that you might have went through during the TV days, or can you talk about that and how it all started and what you know now?
Yeah. So, look. Long story short, I was very unwell about 5 years ago, and in the end needed to leave Channel 10. And then 6 months later, my tenure at 5AA was terminated. And then 6 months after that, I unfortunately I broke up with my beautiful wife Judith. So she made that call. And the reason for that is that, in a very general sense, I became unwell mentally. I was, very anxious. I guess depression is probably a way of describing all of that. It's hard to know exactly. But I just became very unhinged. I mean, that was building up, obviously, Aaron, as the, to that point where everything fell apart. So it just didn't happen like that. I mean, it was sort of building up. And I knew it was building up, but I didn't really know what to do about it. And then once Judith and I split up, I had to move out, of course, and moved into a house by myself, or actually with Jack, my beautiful puppy. Toby's with me at the moment. I'll introduce you to him in a minute. But Jack's no longer with us, unfortunately. But anyway, Jack and I moved into a house, and I had a bit of money, obviously, as a result of the breakup. But I couldn't work. I didn't feel confident enough to work. And then I started to go downhill far more significantly. I was using every day, not heroin or ice or anything, but just marijuana, cocaine, alcohol, and that continued on for about 2.5, 3 years. So that was, and then I got to the point where I was at my absolute lowest. It was just like, it was just a very terrible time for me and for everyone around me who knew me. Only my close friends, I guess, knew what was going on because I wasn't sort of publicising it. But I wasn't going out much. I was only going out for tea and stuff like that, get petrol or something like that, just the basics. It got to a point where it was very dark, extremely dark, and I would not wish that upon anyone. I would not wish that upon my enemy.
Yeah.
Because it's one step away from not being here, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah. So did you get to that point where you didn't want to be? It was getting that dark where you thought, "Fuck, I'm done. I'm done with this."
Well, yeah, well, I
Yeah.
did, yeah, for sure. I mean, it was so difficult, and as I say, it was difficult for everyone, really.
Mm,
And it's easy to say, "Oh, I should have done something about it earlier," but I guess, and this is always part of my message, but looking back, of course, I should have done something about it earlier. I probably should have done something about it 10 years ago when things started to become a little bit strange for me. But when you're in it, Aaron, it's difficult because you're just surviving and you're not really thinking straight. You're just looking for your next hit or your next drink or whatever it might be, whatever your drug of choice or substance of choice is. So yeah, it was just a slippery slope, and I was heading down at a very significant angle, very,
yeah.
very, 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 very quickly.
Yeah. And you said so there was a mix of depression, mix of anxiety. Was it a mix or was it more I was feeling anxious all the time and a bit depressed, or was it a bit of both?
Well, it's hard. It's hard to say exactly clinically. I'm not really sure. I don't. I mean, it might have been circumstantial. I don't know. I mean, I was going through a bit of a tough time in my personal life, but a lot of people do, and they handle that. They're able to handle it. So I don't really know how to answer that because, look, all I know is that I was off the rails and that I wasn't well, and that I was using drugs and alcohol to make me feel better on that day. Of course, it made me feel worse the next day, but and I certainly don't recommend it. I mean, I'm not here to tell anyone not to take drugs or not to drink. It's not my call to do that. But I just know that it got to a point where whatever it was that I was going through, I needed something to relieve myself. I needed something to help me feel better, and the best way for me at that point was to use, and I did. So I and as a result of using, of course, I felt better for a period of time. Then you feel bad the next day, and so you continue to use, and things start to, again, as I say, they start to de-escalate downhill very quickly.
Mm. So how long were you using while you were on the news? And because it looked like every day you're on the news. So how were you functioning and how were you doing that? Were you using to get onto the news, like to be okay,
No,
or what
no,
was
no, no. I wasn't using while I was working. I mean, I was drinking at night, but I wasn't using any drugs or anything like that. I mean, that never happened. I don't think I ever went on air. Mm, might have once in about 1987. Might have gone on air when I'd had a few too many drinks. I think I got away with it. It was on Melbourne Cup Day when I went to a luncheon. But I'd only ever been on. I never ever. One thing I can be proud of is that despite how I was feeling mentally, I
yeah,
was always professional on air. I was always
yeah,
professional during the day. You'd never have known.
yeah,
But I never used while I was on air. I never drank during the day. I mean, and prior to all of this, I wasn't using drugs. I mean, I did when I was young. I didn't use cocaine when I was young, but I started smoking dope at 14, on and off. But when I was at the ABC, when I was at Channel 10, I never used drugs at all. And I never ever drank before going on air. So, um, yeah, I mean, I'm proud of that. I didn't really think to, I mean, I just wanted to be professional. Not that I had to
mm,
think about it. It just didn't occur to me. But once I got unwell, and even prior to leaving Channel 10, once I got unwell, the only thing I was really doing was going home at night and drinking. I wasn't
yeah.
using anything else at that point.
How'd you pull yourself together? Like, I'm assuming I wouldn't know, but how'd you pull yourself together being on the news? Like, I'm sure that's high pressure, yeah? Like, that's quite high pressure to be on point and
Mm.
speaking well. And how did you pull yourself together? Did you just switch gears like when you're at the news and you know how you can just sometimes snap out of it sometimes just for a moment and
Yeah,
do what you need to do? Is that what you did?
Yeah, well, you answered the question really for me. I mean, I did snap out of it. I mean, I wasn't feeling anxious and unwell every single day, but I'd say probably for the last 5 years prior to leaving Channel 10, I was probably having more bad days than I
Mm,
was having good days. But yeah, I just learnt to. I mean, I guess the best way to explain it is that if I went to work and I was unwell, I'd just make sure that the mask that I was wearing,
mm,
which is another thing I talk about. A lot of people wear masks. I mean, people aren't as they appear, and I certainly wasn't as I appeared at work. I mean, at work, I'll just go back a sec. At work, I think I was popular and I was funny and hopefully I was a mentor to others. That was when I had the mask on.
Mm.
Um, so I would put the mask on in the morning, metaphorically speaking, I'd bolt it on
Mm.
and I'd go to work. And then as the day went on and we got closer to me having to perform, I was probably, when you're busy, when I was busy, I was less anxious,
Yeah.
ironically.
Yeah.
But as the day went on, Aaron, and as things sort of started to, reach a fairly significant crescendo, which they do in a newsroom every day. If I was feeling unwell, that was okay. I just sort of parked that and understood that I had to go on air in 2 minutes. And so, as I was about to, as I was about to step up onto the plate and sit alongside of Beck or George or whoever it was, John Overton in the earlier days. I would just move into another gear, and of course I'd do a good job. I think I can say I was a good presenter. I was different, but I think I was a good presenter. I'd been doing it for a long time, and so yeah, I just snapped out of however I was feeling, and I did a good job. The moment I finished, if I was having a bad day, the moment I finished, as I walked away, I would sort of go back into that anxious, sort of unsure mode. But I don't think you would ever have seen me on air and thought, Mark's unwell. I mean,
Mm.
it's one thing I'm proud of it in a way. I mean, it wasn't healthy for me because in the end the mask falls off. The bolts, start to rust, and in the end it's just impossible to put the mask on, which of course is what happened. But I'm proud of myself that I was able to perform for the audience, and I was getting paid well. I had responsibilities and obligations with Channel 10 and 5AA when I was doing breakfast radio with AA. The ABC, Triple M, Mix 102.3. Whenever I was on, I was on. And a lot of people are like that. I'm not the only person on the planet that's like that.
Yeah.
You're working with people. I mean, there are people all over the place who are on and functioning, but they're unwell. So
Yeah.
you just get used to it.
Mm. Let's talk about the mask because I believe in that too, and I believe that's a big reason for a lot of our issues. What was the mask that you had to put on, and what was underneath the mask? Who was Mark underneath the mask, and what was the difference between the mask and who Mark was behind the mask?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a good question. I haven't really been asked that before. I think, look, the mask just protected me and allowed me to act and be Mark Aiston, who everyone loved, I hope, and cared for and enjoyed. And that was someone who was funny, engaging, good communicator, hopefully helping other people. Uh, Occasionally got a bit stressed and a bit snappy, but that's a newsroom. That's the nature of working in a newsroom, or indeed any job that's stressful. Any job really. And so yeah, the mask just allowed me to be that happy-go-lucky type person. There's only a few people in the newsroom that knew I was unwell, and obviously if I was talking to them, then the mask came off, and I'd say, look, I'm not well, blah blah blah, whatever it might be, and then we just go back to our normal business, and I'd put the mask back on. So yeah, it just allowed me to be whatever normal is, Aaron. It just
Yeah.
allowed me to be just a normal person that came into work and did his job, and then went out and got a good story, and then came back and presented well, you know. So that's what that mask was all about. And I think I think you could probably describe that as what most people use the mask for. I mean,
Yeah.
the more I think about it, that's exactly what a mask is for.
Yeah.
But in answering your question, what was I really like behind the scenes, behind the mask? Um, yeah, look, I was anxious. I was very unconfident. I was worried, depressed, probably. So yeah, it was protecting me from that and showing the world that. And only
Yeah.
a few close friends understood and knew that.
Yeah. The reason why I love your story, and especially the mask thing, I think a lot of us wear masks, but because you were on TV, it feels like it would have been amplified because
Oh yeah,
you
oh yeah,
had to wear a
yep,
mask.
yep,
You can't
no
go on
doubt.
the news and be anxious and be. You have to be a certain way. It's a lot of
Yep.
people watching you.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I've been asked that many a time. That's a really good point. Same with the doctor, same with the nurse, same. I mean, to be honest, it's the same with probably a lot of positions. But I think probably, you know, with something like this where you see people in the street, hi Mark, how you going? Oh, you're so good at what you do. We love it when you're funny. Da 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 da. Saw you on the Melbourne Cup. Saw you on the Sydney Olympics. Da 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 da. You've got such a high profile job. It does make it difficult in the sense that you've got to uphold that persona, I guess. And look, a lot of people who are in high profile positions, it is an extra pressure. There's no doubt about it. I go back to a doctor. I mean, a doctor, it's a high profile position and far more significant in my view, and nurses even more significant than what I'll ever do, in my view. That's a topic for another day. But so they're in high profile positions amongst their group, but they're not known publicly significantly
Yeah.
anyway. And so, yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it's an image that you need to uphold, and it's an image that you need to uphold that puts pressure on you, because when you look, a lot of people who are in TV are not what they appear, and I'm not saying that in a negative way. I'm just saying that it's an act for a lot of people, not for everyone, but it's an act. And for me, for a long time, it was an act in the sense that, yes, I am funny and I am a good communicator and I am personable and I am caring, etc., etc. But that's not how I was feeling, because I was quite unwell.
Yeah.
So it's not as if I was putting on that persona, but I was actually a really nasty person.
Yeah.
It's just that I was putting on that persona, despite the fact that I was unwell.
Yeah. Yeah. What you're describing is like I learned a while ago where we, what people perceive us as and what we perceive ourselves as, the bigger the gap, the more we're going to struggle internally. And it sounds like I went through it too, and it sounds like you went through it, which is people perceive me as this confident, happy, funny dude, but deep down I'm feeling pretty much the opposite. There's a gap.
Yeah, no, you're right, and it's strange because to sort of to dig deeper into that statement, it's weird because even though I wasn't well and I was unconfident, I was doing some things that were extremely high profile and demanded a lot of concentration and a lot of confidence. Like I was presenting in front of 1,000 people at the convention centre as a host, or I was sitting at the news desk presenting in front of, back in those days, maybe 80 or 90,000 people. I know that's a bit different because you don't see them.
Yeah.
Or I was commentating AFL football, or I was co-hosting a breakfast show. So it's hard to explain because whilst I wasn't feeling confident about it, I was still able to do it at a pretty high level, which is sort of weird, really. I mean, again, that's maybe a topic for another day, and you could really deep dive into that. But so I guess what I'm saying is it's not like people were thinking, oh, he's not very good at his job lately. Something's going on. Oh, he's really poor. He's not. I don't think that ever happened. I think even until the last day I presented on air, and I'm not the best presenter in the world. I wasn't the best certainly wasn't the best football commentator, in Australia, and I certainly wasn't the best radio host. But I know that I did it to a significant level to be able to get those jobs in commercial TV and radio. So obviously I have ability, but it was a bit. It's the best way to describe it. I guess I was doing all those things at the same time as maybe sort of pulling a truck behind me. So, privately and in my own mind, it was like a real grind. Whereas most people thought it was just, oh, you can do that. That's easy.
Yeah. It's quite amazing that you were doing that. You were doing that at such a high standard. And
I was only thinking about that today. Actually, I took Toby for a walk, and I was thinking about how proud I am. There's a lot of things I'm not proud of, but one of the things I am proud of is that I was able to do my job at a very high level for over 40 years, and that in itself, I think, deserves a big pat on the back. And we don't do that. I've been sort of tweeting, and not so much tweeting, but sending out little messages on LinkedIn and Facebook and TikTok. I don't know whether they're making a difference, but they probably help me. But just basically saying, particularly in recent times, don't knock yourself. Try not to knock yourself, because there's enough people out there knocking you. So you don't need to add to those numbers. But rather than knock yourself, just be proud of what you've done. If you do something that's not the best, be proud of what you did that was good, and just work on the things that weren't good.
Yeah.
So,
That's a good
so
message.
that anyway, getting back to my point, I think, yeah, there's no doubt that I felt and still do feel very proud that I was able to do what I did at such a high level. Whether I was unwell
Yeah.
or not, I mean, it's just a
Yeah.
good feeling.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually quite unbelievable. And I think a lot of people who do struggle with anxiety, they've got more strength than they realize. If you look back on your
Yeah,
life, you've done many things you did when you were anxious or depressed. It's
100%.
it's unbelievable. Can we go back to Mark when he was younger? What was driving Mark to get into TV? What was the pull? Was it just
Mm,
did he like I'm trying to paint a picture of who Mark was. Was
mm.
he what kind of kid was he? Was he shy? Was he outgoing? Was he the same? Was he shy or anxious but outwardly he was confident or was who was Mark when he was younger?
So there's two questions there. So the first point I'll make is that I never really had aspirations to be a TV presenter or a sports commentator. I just fell into it, and I'll give you the short story of that in a second. Second question you asked is what sort of person was I? I was anxious, very unconfident, very nervous. In fact, when I was 7 or 8, whenever my grandparents, I lived with my grandparents and my mum and dad there for about 7 years, and whenever my grandparents would take me to meet one of my aunties, I struggled to get out of the car. I was just nervous. I don't remember that, but I know that happened because prior to my grandmother passing, she told me that. I don't remember it because I was so young, but I know that that's what happened. So just in a general sense, I was I was very unconfident, very nervous, but again, I was sort of, you know, the funny guy at the party. My humour has developed over the years thanks to Dad, but I was always a funny guy. I was always someone who liked to make other people feel good about themselves. I was a good friend, but I was still very unsure. Not the only person on the planet
Yeah.
that's growing up unsure, Aaron, but that's
Yeah.
how I was.
Yeah.
And in answering in more detail the first point you made about how I got into sport, I never wanted to be a TV presenter. I didn't yearn, that wasn't my goal, or a reporter, or a radio host, or a football commentator. At 14, I left school and worked for my father in his gym in Hindley Street. And in those days, in the 70s, it was a very eclectic group of people that you would be dealing with in the street. It was a very dangerous street, but we enjoyed it. We were protected to a large degree. And it certainly helped me with my communication skills, depending on who I was communicating with, whether it be a drug addict or a drug dealer or a criminal or someone who was gay, someone who just got out of prison, a pimp, a prostitute, a normal person. I mean, that gave me the confidence and the skills to communicate at any level, which is a great thing. I'm very, very pleased about that. But working in Hindley Street from 14, was an experience, a tough experience and an unusual upbringing. At that point, I just started punting, so I just started gambling, and I loved it. Dad was a gambler, and I loved it, absolutely loved it. So I started, and then I went to the race course before the age of 18, which I shouldn't have done, but and so I got to know the people on the race course. And one of Dad's very good friends was, bless him, he's passed now, but was a guy called Jim Eason. He was a bookmaker. And at the age of 18, Jim and Dad got together and said, Mark's still working for you, Keith. My father, Keith. But Jim said, why don't we get Mark to work on the race course? He can work for me as a bookmaker's clerk, writing the bets down. So at 18, I started working at the races. And then I met Bruce McAvaney, and then I became interested in calling races. And so I guess that's how I sort of stumbled into media. I then started calling races, and I did that for 2 years. And then at the end of the 2 years, because I hadn't put the work in, I was smoking a bit of dope as well, not while I was calling. So my memory wasn't great. I had a good voice and good, and I knew the form, but I didn't do it as well as I could. So at the end of the 2 years, in about 79, about 80, I lost my job there. Not for anything that I did wrong or anything, but I lost my job because I just wasn't quite good enough. And then I went back and worked for Dad, and then a year or so later I went up to Darwin for 2 years. So again, I was a bit lost. I went up to Darwin with who's now my best friend, Brad Jones. And, we did a lot of silly things up there, but I also called the races at Fanny Bay. I called the greyhounds. I did a bit of TV. I just stumbled into it because
Mm,
I'd been doing those race calls. You understand what I mean, Aaron?
mm,
And then I got a phone call from Mum when I was up there in a pretty bad way, and she said there's a job this is in about '83, and she said there's a job at the ABC in Adelaide as a sports reporter. So I applied for it, and long story short, I got the job, and that's sort of how I sort of fell into it. It wasn't as
yeah.
if I'd woken up one morning and said I really. And then when I went to the ABC, to give you a bit of context, when I went to the ABC, it was a radio job, so it was a radio sports presenter. So I was doing a little radio show at about 6 o'clock every night. I was putting it together during the day. So that was the radio side of things at the ABC. But then there was a TV side as well, and that was run by different people. And back in those days, there was no sports presenters. It was just the reader reading the news and the sport and the weather.
Yeah.
And they thought, why don't we get Mark maybe to see if he's any good at TV, and we'll get. So that's how I started presenting sport. So as I say, I didn't. It wasn't the sort of thing that I was absolutely desperate for.
Yeah.
I fell
As
into it.
you, yeah, that's amazing. So as you were talking, a question come up, and I can kind of see myself in you when I was younger as well. I was kind of funny, but I was a really nervous kid. I think for me, and I think for a lot of people, I don't know if it's for you, there's a need to be accepted by others by performing, by being whoever I need to be accepted. Was that something that you think was happening for you when you were younger, and how you developed that mask of I, I'm
Well,
realizing being funny is getting me attention and accepted. I'm realizing certain character traits are getting me accepted. Is that
mm,
something that you experienced too?
not so much in that situation, but certainly with my father, and I think this is probably partly where all of this comes from. I never really felt as though I was totally accepted by Dad. I always felt that Dad never really had total confidence in me, yet he'd say he had total confidence
Yeah.
in me. So I think I'm like a lot of people. I think you go out of your way to try and impress people so that you gain acceptance, rather than doing those things for yourself.
Mm,
Um, I, yeah, I wouldn't say that I mean, let's put it this way. I don't necessarily go out there expecting praise for what I do. However, however, I do, and I advocate this generally. I don't think enough bosses praise their workers
mm,
or employees. I think it's all about money, and it's all about, well, you've done the job today. We need to do it again and again and again. That doesn't work these days. You need to sit down with your employees and say, you did a great job. That was wonderful. Hey, sure, we've got to do it again tomorrow, but I'm just telling you. Now, I'm not saying all bosses don't do it, but I think there are so many organisations where they forget about that, and they forget about how important that is for people
mm,
for whatever reason. My wife has a slightly different view. My former wife, bless her, but she's a theatre nurse, and I would often come home and not complain, but I'd say, gee, I did a good job today. I broke 3 stories. But my boss didn't sit me down and say, well done. All it was at the end of the day was, what have you got for tomorrow? Now, I wasn't necessarily looking for that praise in a big way, but it would have been nice. And it would be nice for anyone who works in any business to get that sort of praise. And Judith would say, well, I'm a theatre nurse. I work with doctors all the time. We don't get any praise at all. She said, we just accept it. We're getting paid to do a job. We do the job, and then we go home. So it didn't worry her, I guess is what I'm saying.
yeah.
Did it worry me in a big way? Not really, but I am a big advocate for telling people that they've done a good job. It makes me feel good. Yeah,
Yeah.
sure, that's a bit selfish, but I know that it makes them feel good too.
Mm,
So I think that's
yeah.
really important. So just summarising that answer, I think it was more the fact that I was doing things to impress my father
Yeah.
to gain acceptance. Not that he didn't love me,
Yeah.
but I think I was doing things in the early days to get my father's acceptance rather than along the journey, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I think in one way or the other, we all perform for love. It's like we're performing to get love, be
I think
accepted by
so.
by
I
someone.
think so.
And
Yeah.
I think for boys, a lot of it is our fathers deep down, very deep down.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you've got to remember that, and Dad was a good man. He was very rarely there in the early days because he was working so hard. He was working, he had a little deli. Dad was a runner. He was the best runner in the world at one stage. He won a world title. He was
Jesus.
an athlete,
Wow.
and then he became a coach. But back in those days, he was running a small deli for 12 months. Then after that, he was the night manager at a place called the Havana on Glen Osmond Road. So I didn't see a lot of Dad. This was when I was living with my grandparents because Dad unfortunately lost the house that he was trying to buy due to gambling. And so we all moved into my grandmother and grandfather's place. So there was me, Dad, my sister, later my brother, and of course Mum and Dad. And so I had a great upbringing from the point of view of my grandmother and my grandfather, but Dad wasn't there very often, certainly in those days. And Mum was unwell because Mum suffered severe depression and was in and out of hospital. So it was a bit unusual.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
So let's let's go forward again, if that's okay. So let's go to the point where you start to realize it's getting out of hand, and you decide to leave Channel 10 and say, I need to work on myself. What happened then? Like,
Well, I didn't leave Channel 10 and say I need to work on myself. I left Channel 10 and then went into a complete and utter dark hole. So that dark hole lasted about 3.5 years. Um, Living by myself, had a bit of money, was able to use whatever, get up when I wanted, go to bed when I wanted, do what I wanted. I had Jack at the time. Um, and that lasted for about 3.5 years. It just got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. It was just horrible, really. And my sister rang me one day and said, "Do you want to come down to a lovely little restaurant down at Glenelg, a seafood restaurant, and have tea?" So somehow I struggled to get down there, and when I got there, Brad was there, my best mate, as well. So I immediately understood that something was up. And, they both told me that they loved me and they cared for me and that they were extremely worried. And they said, with your blessing, is there something we can do? Is there something we can help you with? How can we fix this? And and so they were cautious because they didn't want to upset me. They didn't really know what to expect. I could have just gone and said, "Get stuffed, I'm leaving. It's my world, it's my life, don't tell me what to do." But I knew we all had a bit of a cry, and I knew that obviously things had reached a significant crisis point. And so we decided that the best course of action for me was to go to rehab. And so I went home that night and I went onto the internet and looked at three places. One was in Melbourne, one was in Sydney, I think, one was in Brisbane, and one was overseas. Sent emails out. Next morning, somehow got up, went and walked Jack. I was walking Jack up at the park, and I got a phone call, and it was from the owner of the Melbourne Rehab Centre, the Hayter Clinic, and he said to me, because he knew who I was because of my profile, even though I don't have a massive profile nationally, I've still done a lot of stuff nationally, and he said, "Look, I know your story." He said, "But tell me a bit more." So we spoke for about 40 minutes. I probably cried for half of that because he was asking some pretty poignant questions. He wasn't mucking around. He wasn't dicking around. He said, "Okay." He said, "Get your ass over to Melbourne." And he said, "I'll look after you for 3 months and we'll get you well." And so that next day, that was about 11 o'clock on the Tuesday. Yeah, on the Tuesday. Yeah, and then that next Tuesday at 11 o'clock, I was in Melbourne. He picked me up at the airport at Tullamarine. I got into his car. And the Hayter Clinic have two clinics. They have one at Geelong and one in Melbourne, in Essendon. And he drove me down to the clinic down at Geelong, which was the first one that I needed to stay at for a month. And we had a great chat, and I managed to stay there for 3 months, and I haven't used since.
wow.
I haven't used drugs. I haven't had a drink. In fact, I was just saying I work at La Trattoria, which is a great Italian restaurant here in Adelaide. I'm very dear friends with Billy and the former owners and now the new owners. And I walk through that restaurant time and time again, and there's people drinking and stuff. I don't even give it a second thought. It's almost as if I never drank. I have no
Wow.
interest in using again.
How long's that been, Mark, since the rehab?
It's about 3.5 years, almost 4 years. I haven't look. I
Wow.
kept count. I kept count, Aaron, after I left because you always do. But then after that, I thought, no, I'm not going to keep count. I don't need to keep count anymore. I
Yeah.
think it's three. It might be 4 years, three or 4 years.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
And you can never say never because you never know what's around the corner in your life. But I have no interest in drinking or using using at all. None whatsoever. It's not even slightly on my radar. It could be 40 degrees tomorrow and I'm about to leave work. I don't think to myself, gee, it'd be nice to have a beer. I don't even think that. I'm
No.
not the beer was not the beer was my alcohol of choice. It was mainly Scotch and red wine, but
Mm.
I have no interest. So I'm very, very fortunate. And you know, there was a couple of people who left the same time as me, and one of them busted. He was an alcoholic, lovely man, but an alcoholic. So he busted straight afterwards. So again, I'm very proud of myself from that point of view. I mean, don't get me wrong, and I always make this point, Aaron. You know, my life's not perfect now. You know, I'm still working on it. There are still things that, I'm working on significantly, and I'm still climbing that mountain back. You know, and it's a tough road, but it's a lot better than it was 4 years ago.
Yeah, that's amazing. So that's amazing. You don't want to drink, or you don't have the desire to drink, or drugs, or
No.
whatever. A lot of us know that that is the thing that suppresses the emotions or the
Mm.
traumas or whatever. So how have you dealt with the stuff that was suppressing? So the drugs and alcohol was suppressing some sort of darkness or emotions or trauma.
Yeah.
How have you dealt with that since without the drugs or alcohol?
Well, and that's a very good question as well. And look, I'm still working on that because, I'll be upfront. I still get anxious, and I still have my down moments. There's no doubt, like everyone does.
Yeah.
But I'm just doing my best to keep as well as I can, as fit as I can. I mean, that's going reasonably well. It's not going as well. I'm being totally transparent. It's not going as
Yeah.
well as it could be. Um, I mean, I could be going to the gym 5 days a week and going upstairs and pushing the weights. There are days where I just don't feel like it mentally, and so I don't do it. Of course, I could, but I don't. I choose not to. So I'm working on that because I understand that being fit is certainly one significant aspect of it. I meditate on and off. Again, being totally transparent, I don't meditate every day. I'll give you some reasons as to why this pattern occurs in a minute. What else am I doing? I'm trying to be more organised. So rather than go into work, and this is definitely work in progress. But when I get most anxious and upset is when I go into work, for example, and I've got a million things to do, but I haven't written any down, and I'll be going,
Mm,
yeah, oh yeah, what about that? Oh God, I forgot that. The boss will ring me and say, oh what? And that causes a major panic. So
yeah.
it's just being disciplined, and it's not that difficult, but procrastination is certainly an issue. Um, you know, uh, Being organised is something that's very, very important to me. Sorry, being organised is something that's very, very important when it comes to dealing with mental health, because you
Yeah.
don't want to be overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Um, I obviously spend a lot of time with Toby, who's on the bed. I'll introduce you to him in a minute.
Yeah.
He's very, very important to me. I keep in contact with my daughter. The other thing that's important, and again, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but these are the things that I try and do, is I try not to think, and it's not doesn't work all the time, but I try not to think about what happened in the past because there's a lot of shame there.
Mhm.
And of course, once you start thinking about the past and you get shamed, then shame is very much an instigator for depression and anxiety because it's terrible, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
So, I do my best. I'm listening to a very good audio book at the moment from Matthew McConaughey called Green Lights, which is fantastic. I would recommend it to anyone who wants to live a better life. It's a bit different. Matthew's different, the actor, but
Mm,
there's some wonderful techniques in there that I'm working on as well. The other thing that I am working on is not being a people pleaser. And
mhm.
again, being a people pleaser is synonymous with anxiety and depression because,
Yeah.
as you alluded to so eloquently earlier, we all want acceptance. And when you're not feeling accepted, or you're feeling unwell, or you're feeling, as though things are falling apart, one of the ways of feeling better is either putting other people down or is yearning for acceptance. So and that's all fine, but you shouldn't be doing that by being a people pleaser, because in the end you'll be saying yes to everything simply to gain acceptance, and half the things you're saying yes to you don't want to do. So that,
Yeah.
that sort of defeats the purpose.
Yeah.
So they're the sorts of things I'm doing. They're all a work in progress.
Yeah.
They're all a work in progress, and they all take a lot of courage to do and commitment.
Yeah.
And so I'm doing all of those, Aaron, as best I can.
That's amazing. Yeah. Like you said, we're never. One sec, sorry, Mark.
You're right.
I'll cut this out. The microphone's a bit. All right. Can you hear me, Mark?
Yep, all good.
Oh, I have to cut that out. Train of thought. Yeah. So, yeah, we're all a work in progress. That's the whole
Yeah,
point. We're never going to get to a point, and that's why I'm glad you said it. I always make sure I tell everyone that as well. We're never going to be perfect. That's actually part of the healing process. Realizing we're never going to be perfect. We're going to have anxiety. We're going to not want to get out of bed at times. That's okay. Like,
yeah.
I think one of the issues is us trying to be perfect. That is one of the issues of us putting the mask on, pretending we're perfect. That is
Well,
one of the
well, yeah, and again, that's probably a topic for another day. But you're right. If you have expectations of being perfect, then you're never going to be satisfied. So
yeah,
yeah, and athletes, high achievers have those expectations, and they're just unrealistic. When I was calling football in the early days, I'd be calling for 2.5, 3 hours, and in that time, you'd make mistakes, and I'd walk away thinking, "Oh God, I stuffed that up today." But what I wasn't realizing was that I did 95% of it right,
yeah,
99% of it right, and I got a couple of little things wrong. Not bad, nothing
yeah,
major.
yeah,
And so I had to teach myself, which I still struggle with, but I had to teach myself to say, Mark, you are not going to get 3.5 hours of live on air perfect. It is just
yeah,
not going to happen. It wouldn't happen
yeah,
with, bless his heart, it wouldn't happen with Bruce McAvaney. Not that he'd make a
yeah,
factual mistake, but he
yeah,
might stumble over a word or but whatever. And so that's totally unrealistic. So I mean that's just stupidity to
yeah,
think that. I mean, sure, there were times where I hosted on air and I got off the set and I went, you know what, that was 100%, not a mistake, great in it. In fact, I got to a point that was different. That was 7 or 8 minutes only. That was a bit different because it's not as long, and you can do those sorts of things almost perfectly. But when you want to achieve perfection all the time, it's just a downhill slope.
yeah, for sure, for sure. Um, so I've got a question. If your 15-year-old version was next to you right now, what advice would you give to him? What would you tell him? What would he need from you, you think?
Yeah, so the most important thing I'd say is if you're feeling unwell, make sure you seek help. Now, that's easy to say now in hindsight, and I spoke at a football club a week ago and said exactly the same thing. And I make the same point. It's easy for me to say that if you start to feel unwell, seek help. The trick there is that if you go back to when I started to feel unwell, or even way back when I was young, I wasn't excuse me, I wasn't consciously thinking, "Oh, I don't feel well, I better seek help," because you're
Yeah,
so embroiled in feeling unwell. But I guess if we can get the message out that even if you feel as though things are going well, but there's just a little bit of a waver there, just address it. Now, what you do, I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert in that area. Whether you talk to your wife, your brother, your sister, your teacher, your friend, your psychologist, your psychiatrist, your doctor, whatever. If you feel as though things are just starting to go a bit wonky, I guess what I'm saying is I don't want you to not do anything and then end up where I ended up, which is in this terribly dark hole where I could have ended it all. I don't
yeah,
want anyone to end up there. So that would be my advice. There's a lot of other things I'd say to myself, but I think for the purpose of what we're talking about, it would be that. I
yeah,
could say things like, be more confident, really work hard, be more organized. But all of those things are irrelevant when you're unwell. So it would definitely be something like that.
yeah.
It's a
That's
good question, that one.
yeah. Thank you, thank you. Um, is there anything else that you would tell men? Like, because I think we're in a new age where it's becoming people like yourself, and people in higher profiles, and are starting to come out and talk about their
Mm.
emotions and their mental health. But for those men who are still stuck in that, I refuse to get help. I refuse to like. I'll push through. Like I know you kind of just said it, but like, what would you give a grown man advice for? Like who might be struggling? He might be in that hole right now that you were in 5 years ago or whatever.
Yeah. Well, again, I think, Aaron, we just both answered it. I mean, there's no point me thinking of a secondary answer because
Yeah.
the most important thing is that you need to be aware enough to understand that maybe things aren't quite right, and you need to be courageous enough to do something about it. Again, I don't know what that is specifically. It's going to be different for everyone. I can remember doing a talk to a whole lot of farmers at Bordertown about 3 years ago, and of course, farmers traditionally have a lot of mental health issues.
Mm.
Let me pull back on that. Farmers who have a lot of mental health issues, it can be significant because a farmer, a guy who runs a farm with his wife and 3 kids, he is traditionally seen as the man, as the
Yeah.
person that is the strong
Provider.
man, and
Yeah.
yeah, and the pillar, the person that's bringing in the you know the wages and looking at. I mean, that's how they perceive it anyway, and so they are seen as being strong, and so anything that pushes them off that mantle, they struggle with. So when they're feeling unwell, rather than addressing it and doing something about it, they just push it to one side. So they're a
Yeah.
good example,
Yeah.
but I'd say that to anyone. Again, yeah, it's it can creep up on you. And addiction, of course, I know we've sort of spoken about addiction and mental health, but the two work hand in hand. And addiction, particularly, is very Machiavellian. It can. I mean, at the moment, I'm addicted to this, right? Coke,
Mm.
as in
Mm.
Coca-Cola. We can't see that with my background. Now, I say addicted. What I'm saying to you, and I alluded to my weight.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is I default to a Coke every night now. I've got into a habit. That's me. I need to get out of that habit. It might not be a big deal. I've put on 3 or 4 kilos. It's not going to kill me. That's all fine. But I'm aware that because of the way my brain is wired, I now have to think consciously about getting rid of this.
Yeah.
You,
Yeah.
you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so addiction and mental health sort of can work hand in hand. But I guess the point I was about to make was that they can also creep up on you.
Yeah.
So when I started drinking this Coke about 6 months ago, I wasn't thinking be careful. I just kept drinking it.
It was just an innocent Coke. Yeah.
Yeah, and now six
Yeah.
months later, I put on 3 kilos, and I know why, because I'm
Yeah.
addicted.
Yeah.
So
True.
again,
Good
we go
point.
back to my point about if you're feeling a little bit slightly wonky or a little bit unwell, or you're not 100% sure what's going on, seek help. It's easy for me to say that. It's more difficult for people to identify that, because here
Yeah.
I am 6 months earlier getting on this, and I probably a week later should have said, Mark, this is
Yeah.
not a good idea, but I
Yeah. Yeah.
didn't. So
Yeah.
it's easy for me to give that advice. It's difficult for people to identify it and understand that something's going on, and then take the action to do something about it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I would have done that 5 years ago, wouldn't I? And I wouldn't be
Yeah.
talking to you now. I'd still be presenting on Channel 10 and still be doing breakfast radio.
That's a good point. Very good point. I think we wait for the pain to outweigh, the pleasure. When things get too painful, we start to look at it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Although, yeah, possibly. But as I said, addiction's very, very, very Machiavellian, and there can be many times where someone who's addicted to something, they know what the pain is, but the addiction's just too strong, which is very
Yeah.
sad. Very
Yeah.
sad. Look, I was lucky, and I guess one thing I did, you said, what do you do to keep yourself well? What I One thing I didn't mention, which is really important, and that is to be grateful. So, look, I'm
Yeah.
sitting in a room at the moment. I'm renting a house. My dog's on the bed. Do I have a lot of possessions? Not really. When I was working at Channel 10, I had a brand new car. I had a beautiful house, I had a beautiful wife. We went overseas every year, blah, 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 blah. Wore magnificent clothes. I mean, I don't necessarily miss any of those things, but the point I'm making is, to be grateful for what I've got now, and to understand that the mere fact I've got a roof over my head and I've got 3 pillows on the bed, and they're all clean, and there's a sheet and a lovely warm doona there because it was cold last night, and the fact that I've got a computer, the fact that I've got a phone, the fact that I've
Yeah.
got enough money to buy a coffee,
Mm.
I've got a hat that I can wear, things like that I wouldn't have even given a second thought.
Yeah.
Um, the fact that I've got a job, for God's sake.
Yeah.
I mean, I said I don't have a new car. I do have a new car, actually, thanks to a very dear friend of mine. But um, uh, that sure, that's important to me, but all those other things are probably more important to me, those other little things. The fact that I've got 3 or 4 good friends, the fact that my sister still loves me and my brother still loves me, the fact that I have a beautiful daughter, the fact that I'm still talking to my wife, the fact that I'm still included in my wife's in-laws' birthdays and Christmas. I mean, God,
Yeah.
I am so lucky, really. I am
Yeah.
so lucky.
That's another good point. Gratitude. It's huge.
Mm,
It's huge. Well, thank you
yeah,
for doing this interview. I appreciate you coming on, being vulnerable, sharing your story, and
that's all
yeah,
right, mate.
it's an inspiration. Do you want people to follow you somewhere or like
Well, yeah.
look
I
you
mean,
up?
I didn't do it necessarily for that. But look, I do probably once, twice, 3 times a week. I do just little hopefully inspirational little videos on LinkedIn, TikTok, and Instagram, and Facebook. And when I go into TikTok, I don't use all those little apps where there's music and funny moustaches and stuff like
Mm,
that.
mhm.
I just do them pretty basically, and quite often they're just what I'm thinking at the time. But if those sort of things can help anyone, and they're nothing groundbreaking. They're all very, very obvious. I mean, for example, I did one today, and it was just with Toby. Toby, come over here. Toby, come here. Come and say
Yeah,
hello. Come on.
that's
I
me,
did.
Toby.
I did one with Toby. Come up here. Come up here and say hello.
Oh, Toby.
Who's that?
Oh,
Who's
hello,
that?
Toby.
So I
Hello,
just did a little.
Toby.
I just did a beautiful one with Toby, saying how much I appreciate him being around and how much I love him and how much a
Yeah,
major part of my life he is. And
yeah,
so we should never take anything like that for granted. That's for sure.
yeah.
Aaron,
Dogs are literally a man's best friend. They
they
just
are.
love. They
Oh,
unconditionally love. They
mate.
unconditionally love.
Mate, I'd give anything to be back in a relationship with Judith, but the moment I leave, if I'm working at La Trattoria, which I do 3 nights a week, or whether he's just up on the bed again, or if I leave work, I might go to the gym first, but on the way back, I'm just thinking about him.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm very, 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 very lucky. I mean, I miss Jack. Jack was there when I was in my darkest days, but Toby's a great source of, inspiration and love for me. So, mm.
that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, thanks again. And did you say what your handle was so people can? Is it just Mark Aiston TikTok or?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it's
Yeah,
just Mark Aiston, or
yeah.
if you put in Mark Aiston, I think my handle for Instagram is Get On TV, I think, but everything else is if you just put in Mark Aiston, I think, or Mark, yeah, something like that. But
Awesome.
again,
Thank you again.
I didn't do this to
Yeah.
promote that. I
No,
was
that's okay.
just happy to talk to you
Yeah.
about my life, and how and maybe just hopefully help others.
Yeah. It definitely will. Definitely will. Appreciate it. Thank you again.
Thanks, Aaron. Good to talk to you, my friend.
Thanks for watching this episode of Hearts of Men. I really appreciate it. If you could give back and give a like, a comment, a share, a review on any of the platforms you're watching on, that would really help me get my message out to more men. If you don't follow me on socials, please follow me, Aaron Cartwright, All Things Healing on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks, guys. See you on the next episode.